The Evans ball was proceeding exactly as planned until Charlotte, hiding behind her usual marble column, discovered that champagne glasses and trembling hands made a poor combination. England, 1825. The grand ballroom of the Evans townhouse glittered beneath the light of 3 massive crystal chandeliers, each holding 100 candles that cast dancing shadows across silk gowns and polished boots. The opening ball of the London season was in full swing, and Lady Margaret Evans had spared no expense in presenting her youngest daughter to society. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of hothouse roses, beeswax candles, and expensive French perfume. An orchestra positioned in the corner gallery played a lively country dance, the music swelling and receding like waves against a shore. Miss Charlotte Evans stood partially concealed behind one of the marble columns that lined the ballroom's perimeter, her fingers clutching the folds of her lavender silk gown. At 23, she had long since abandoned any hope of making a brilliant match. Her role tonight, as it had been for the past 5 seasons, was to remain unobtrusive while her younger sister claimed the spotlight that Charlotte had never quite managed to capture for herself. And what a spotlight it was. Miss Amelia Evans, just 19 and in her first official season, stood at the centre of her admiring circle near the grand staircase. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with silk roses, and her gown of pristine white satin caught the candlelight with every movement. She possessed the kind of classical beauty that poets celebrated, all perfect proportions and porcelain skin, blue eyes that sparkled with confidence Charlotte had never felt. "Have you ever seen such perfection?" Lady Rothwell whispered loudly to her companion, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Miss Amelia is positively radiant. She will have a dozen proposals before the season ends, mark my words." Charlotte pressed herself further behind the column, making herself smaller. She had heard such comparisons her entire life. Where Amelia was golden and bright, Charlotte was merely brown, her hair a simple chestnut without remarkable shine, her eyes the colour of bark rather than sapphires. Her features were pleasant enough, her mother had once said with obvious disappointment, but pleasant had never launched 1,000 ships or secured a brilliant marriage. "Charlotte, darling, do try to circulate," her mother hissed, appearing suddenly at her elbow. Lady Margaret Evans wore burgundy silk that emphasised her still handsome features, though years of social climbing had etched permanent lines of calculation around her mouth. Standing in corners like a potted plant does nothing for your prospects, though heaven knows those prospects grow dimmer with each passing season. "Yes, mother," Charlotte murmured, though she made no move to emerge from her sanctuary. Lady Margaret sighed with exasperation. "At least try to look pleasant. Lord and Lady Pemberton have just arrived, and I will not have them thinking I raised a sullen daughter alongside a perfect one." With that, she swept away to greet the new arrivals, leaving Charlotte alone with her uncomfortable thoughts. A stir near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The orchestra faltered momentarily before recovering, and a hush fell over the gathered crowd like a blanket settling over embers. Charlotte peered around the column to see what had caused such a reaction. The Duke of Thornfield had arrived. Alexander Bellini moved through the parting crowd with the unconscious authority of a man born to command respect. At 29, he cut an impressive figure in his formal evening attire, all dark superfine wool and snowy white linen that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean build. His hair, nearly black in the candlelight, had been brushed back from a face that would have seemed severe were it not for the intelligence that lit his blue eyes. Those eyes, Charlotte noticed even from her distant vantage point, appeared to miss nothing as they swept the ballroom with cool assessment. Beside him walked an older man who could only be his father. Lord Henry Bellini, though past 60, maintained the rigid bearing of a military officer. His expression suggested he found the entire gathering beneath his notice, though he nodded stiffly to acquaintances as they passed. "The Duke of Thornfield," someone near Charlotte whispered, "and still unmarried. Every mama in London has set her cap for him these past 10 years. "Fat lot of good it has done them," her companion replied. "He has refused every eligible girl from Land's End to Edinburgh. Some say he has ice in his veins instead of blood." Charlotte watched as her mother practically flew across the ballroom to intercept the Bellini men, Lord Edmund Evans following at a more measured pace. The formal introductions seemed to take an eternity, though Charlotte supposed it had been only moments before her mother turned, one hand extended toward where Amelia stood surrounded by admirers. "Your Grace, may I present my daughter, Miss Amelia Evans? Amelia, darling, come make your curtsy to the Duke of Thornfield and Lord Henry." Amelia glided forward, her movements calculated to display her figure to best advantage. She sank into a perfect curtsy, her golden head bowed in a display of maidenly modesty that Charlotte knew was entirely false. When she rose, she tilted her face upward to meet the Duke's gaze, her lips curved in a smile that had devastated lesser men. "Your Grace," she murmured. "What an honour." Lord Henry leaned close to his son, though his voice carried clearly in the relative quiet. "The younger one is Prettier," he said, gesturing subtly toward Amelia. "Perfect lineage, substantial dowry, and accomplished in all the appropriate arts. The Evans family would make an excellent alliance. You could do far worse than securing her before someone else does." Charlotte felt heat flood her cheeks. She should move away, stop eavesdropping on a conversation not meant for her ears. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor. She watched as Lord Henry continued his assessment of Amelia as though she were a broodmare at auction, listing her qualities with the enthusiasm of a man discussing a particularly advantageous business transaction. The Duke remained silent throughout his father's recitation, his expression unreadable. Charlotte expected him to nod in agreement, perhaps request an introduction to Amelia's particular accomplishments, maybe even request a dance. That was how these things worked after all. The powerful Duke, the beautiful debutante, the alliance that would benefit both families. Charlotte turned away, unwilling to witness the inevitable conclusion. She would slip out through the servants' corridor, claim a headache, and spare herself the sight of Amelia's triumph. Her mother would be furious. But what else was new? She took a step backward, intending to flee, and collided directly with a footman carrying a tray of champagne glasses. The crash seemed to echo like thunder through the ballroom. Crystal shattered against the marble floor, champagne spreading in a golden puddle that soaked the hem of Charlotte's lavender gown. The orchestra stumbled to a discordant halt. Every head in the room turned toward the source of the commotion. Charlotte stood frozen in horror, her hands still raised from the instinctive attempt to catch the falling tray. The footman stammered apologies, already kneeling to gather the broken glass. Her mother's face had gone white with fury, and worst of all, she could hear the barely suppressed laughter rippling through the crowd. "How clumsy," someone murmured, not quite quietly enough. "Poor dear, she has always been rather awkward," another voice added with false sympathy. Lord Henry's tone carried clearly across the sudden silence. "The elder daughter, I presume? Unfortunate. Some girls simply lack the grace required for society." Charlotte wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. She should apologize, help clean the mess, do something other than stand there like a statue. But humiliation had locked her joints, turned her tongue to lead. She managed to lift her gaze from the spreading champagne and found herself looking directly into a pair of blue eyes. The Duke of Thornfield was staring at her, not with the amused contempt she expected, nor the polite dismissal that would have been almost as cutting. He looked at her with an intensity that stole what little breath she had remaining, as though she were the only person in the crowded ballroom, as though the shattered glass and spreading whispers simply did not exist. Charlotte could not look away. The moment stretched, became something almost tangible in the space between them. She watched as something shifted in his expression, a decision being made behind those remarkable eyes. Then he moved. Lord Henry reached for his son's arm, clearly intending to steer him back toward Amelia and the waiting alliance. Alexander shrugged off the touch without breaking eye contact with Charlotte. He crossed the ballroom with long, deliberate strides, his boots crunching on scattered glass. The crowd parted before him, whispers rising like startled birds. He stopped directly in front of Charlotte, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had seemed from across the room. She could see the fine weave of his coat, smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something else, something uniquely him. "Miss Charlotte Evans," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear beneath the rising speculation around them. It was not a question. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. She attempted a curtsy and nearly stumbled on her champagne-soaked hem. His hand shot out, steadying her elbow with a touch that seemed to burn through the silk of her glove. "I believe," he said, still in that quiet tone that somehow commanded absolute attention, "the next dance is a waltz." He extended his other hand, palm up, in unmistakable invitation. "Would you do me the honor?" Charlotte stared at his outstretched hand, as though it were a serpent. This could not be happening. Dukes did not dance with clumsy spinsters who destroyed champagne services. Dukes certainly did not ignore beautiful debutantes in favor of their awkward elder sisters. She must have struck her head in the collision, developed a concussion that was causing hallucinations. "Your Grace!" Lord Henry's voice cut through her confusion, sharp with displeasure. "Perhaps you did not understand. Miss Amelia Evans is the younger daughter. This is Miss Charlotte, the elder sister. There has been a misunderstanding." Alexander finally looked away from Charlotte, turning his head just enough to address his father. "There is no misunderstanding, father. I know precisely who I am addressing." Then, to Charlotte's absolute shock, he looked back at her and smiled. It transformed his entire face, softening the aristocratic severity into something warm and almost boyish. "The waltz, Miss Evans. I find I am quite decided on the matter. Charlotte could not seem to form coherent words. "Your Grace, surely you would prefer—" "I would prefer," he interrupted gently, "to dance with you. If you are willing, of course. I will not press where I am not wanted." Somewhere in the background, Charlotte could hear her mother's strangled gasp, the explosion of whispers that greeted this impossible turn of events. She could see Amelia's face, red with mortification and fury. She could feel the weight of 100 stares, the speculation and scandal that would follow this moment. And she could see the Duke's outstretched hand still waiting with infinite patience for her answer. Charlotte placed her trembling fingers in his palm. The contact sent something electric racing up her arm. His hand closed around hers, warm and solid, and impossibly real. He led her toward the center of the ballroom, and the crowd scrambled to clear space for them. The orchestra, apparently deciding that employment was preferable to gawking, struck up a waltz. Alexander's hand settled at her waist, the pressure firm and somehow reassuring through the layers of silk and stays. His other hand clasped hers, lifting their joined fingers to the proper position. Charlotte's free hand found his shoulder, the superfine wool warm beneath her palm. "Breathe," he murmured as the music swelled. "You have forgotten to breathe." She inhaled sharply, and he smiled again, smaller this time, but no less devastating. Then they were moving, sweeping into the waltz with a grace that Charlotte had never managed in all her years of dancing lessons. But Alexander led with such confidence that she found herself following naturally, her body responding to the subtle pressure of his hand at her waist, the gentle guidance of his shoulder beneath her palm. "I apologize for the spectacle," he said quietly as they turned. "I realize I have made you the center of attention in a rather dramatic fashion." "Why?" The word escaped before Charlotte could stop it. "Your Grace, I do not understand. Amelia is right there, and she is everything you could want in a match. Beautiful, accomplished, and willing. Why would you possibly choose to dance with me instead? Do you truly not know?" Something in his expression shifted, became almost vulnerable. "Have you ever considered, Miss Evans, that beauty is not the most important quality in a potential companion? Every debutante in London would argue otherwise," Charlotte replied before she could stop herself. He laughed, a low sound that she felt as much as heard. "Perhaps that is precisely the problem with debutantes in London." They completed another turn, their movements synchronizing with increasing ease. "Tell me, Miss Evans, do you enjoy these grand affairs? The endless parade of forced conversation and false smiles?" Charlotte blinked at the unexpected question. That is hardly relevant, Your Grace. Humour me." She considered lying, offering the expected platitudes about the joys of society and social connection. But something in his eyes, That steady blue gaze that seemed to see past her carefully constructed walls compelled honesty instead. No, she admitted quietly. I find them exhausting and largely pointless. Everyone performing for everyone else, saying what they think should be said rather than what they actually mean. Precisely, he said with satisfaction. And in one sentence, you have demonstrated more authenticity than I have encountered in 5 years of these interminable balls. His hand tightened slightly at her waist as they navigated a particularly crowded section of the floor. That, Miss Evans, is why I chose to dance with you. Because when you looked at me across that champagne-stained floor, you were not calculating how to charm me or plotting to secure my title. You were simply being honest. Charlotte had no response to that. They danced in silence for several measures, the music wrapping around them like a cocoon, temporarily blocking out the whispers and stares. She was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected. The warmth of his hand, the solid strength of his shoulder, the way he smelled of sandalwood and something crisp like winter air. You know this will cause talk, she finally said. Let them talk. Your father is displeased. My father is frequently displeased. It has become his natural state. Despite herself, Charlotte felt a smile tugging at her lips. You are not what I expected, Your Grace. Neither are you, Miss Evans. The waltz was drawing to a close, their movements slowing with the music, which is precisely why I find you fascinating. The final notes faded into silence. Alexander released her waist but kept hold of her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that sent fresh whispers racing through the crowd. His lips barely brushed her glove, but Charlotte felt the touch like a brand. Thank you for the dance, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. I hope it will be the first of many. Then he bowed, released her hand, and walked away, leaving Charlotte standing alone in the center of the ballroom, her heart racing and her mind spinning with impossible possibilities. 3 days had passed since the Evans ball, and Charlotte had not left her bedchamber except for meals taken in rigid silence with her family. She sat in the window seat, knees drawn beneath her pale yellow morning dress, staring at the grey London sky without truly seeing it. Rain tapped against the glass in steady rhythm. The door opened, and Mrs. Helen Foster entered carrying a tea tray. The governess who had raised Charlotte from infancy set the tray down with quiet efficiency before taking the nearby chair. At 52, Mrs. Foster maintained the upright posture and calm demeanour that had made her an excellent educator, though grey streaked her brown hair. You must eat something, dear girl, Mrs. Foster said gently, pouring tea. You barely touched breakfast. I am not hungry, Charlotte replied, though she accepted the cup. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. Mrs. Foster studied her with penetrating eyes that had always seen through childhood fibs. Your mother has been holding court in the drawing room since dawn. Half of London has called to discuss the events of the ball. Charlotte closed her eyes. I can imagine what they are saying. Most are simply curious. Some are scandalized. A few seem almost pleased that someone finally disrupted the tedious predictability of the season. She patted Charlotte's hand. The Duke of Thornfield caused quite a stir by singling you out. He made a mistake, Charlotte said flatly. He was being polite after I made a spectacle of myself. By tomorrow, he will have forgotten the entire incident. I rather doubt that. Raised voices drifted up from the entrance hall below. Mrs. Foster moved to the door, opening it enough to hear clearly. Charlotte remained frozen, dread pooling in her stomach. This is absolutely unacceptable. Lady Margaret's voice carried up the stairs. My beautiful Amelia, humiliated before all of society. That clumsy, awkward girl has ruined everything. Now, Margaret. Lord Edmund's calmer tones attempted to soothe. Charlotte did nothing wrong. The Duke made his choice quite clear. His choice was an aberration. When the Duke calls, as surely he must, we will ensure that Amelia answers. Charlotte will claim illness. Mrs. Foster closed the door and turned back to Charlotte, whose face had drained of colour. Pay her no mind. Your mother has always valued appearance over substance. She cannot fathom that a man like the Duke might prefer genuine feeling to artificial beauty. She is right, though, Charlotte whispered. It was an aberration. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted them. Footsteps hurried across the entrance hall, followed by the butler's formal greeting. Then Lady Margaret's delighted exclamation penetrated through closed doors and floors. "A message from Thornfield! I knew he would write. Amelia, darling, compose yourself. Charlotte, remain upstairs." Mrs. Foster moved swiftly to the door again, listening. When she turned back, her eyes were bright. "A messenger has arrived with a formal invitation." Below, Lady Margaret's voice rose again, delight curdling into confusion and anger. "There must be some mistake. The invitation is addressed specifically to Miss Charlotte Evans, not Miss Amelia Evans." "The messenger insists there is no error, madam," the butler responded. "The Duke of Thornfield requests the pleasure of Miss Charlotte Evans's company for a drive through Hyde Park this afternoon at 2:00. His Grace's carriage will arrive to collect her." Lady Margaret's fury was immediate and spectacular. Charlotte could hear her mother's voice rising to near shrieking levels, demanding the messenger return and correct this obvious mistake. Lord Edmund's deeper tones attempted intervention, while Amelia's voice joined the chaos, shrill with outrage. Mrs. Foster moved to Charlotte's wardrobe and began pulling out afternoon dresses with brisk determination. "The green walking dress, I think. It brings out your eyes. We have less than 4 hours to prepare." "Mrs. Foster, I cannot possibly—" "You can and you will," the governess interrupted firmly. "I have watched you hide in shadows and apologize for existing for far too many years. A gentleman of obvious taste has specifically requested your company. You will not refuse him because your mother wishes you invisible." Charlotte stood on shaking legs. "What if this is just pity or some cruel game? Then you will discover that soon enough. But you will not deny yourself the possibility of something real simply because you are afraid." The argument below escalated. A knock sounded at Charlotte's door, and the butler entered. "Miss Charlotte, your mother requests your immediate presence in the drawing room." Charlotte descended with Mrs. Foster at her side. In the drawing room, Lady Margaret paced before the fireplace, her burgundy morning dress swishing with agitation. Amelia sat on the sofa in tragic despair, dabbing at dry eyes with lace. Lord Edmund stood by the window, his expression thoughtful. "Charlotte," Lady Margaret rounded on her immediately, "you will send word to the Duke declining this invitation. You will cite illness, anything that will allow Amelia to take your place." "I will do no such thing," Charlotte heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. Her mother's face flushed crimson. "You will do as you are told. Your sister is the appropriate match for a duke. You are 23 with no prospects. You will not steal this opportunity from her." "Mother, I have stolen nothing. The Duke extended his invitation to me specifically. To refuse would be rude." "Edmund, tell her. Make her see reason." Lord Edmund moved away from the window, his gaze moving between his wife and daughters. He was a man of moderate height and gentle disposition, rarely involving himself in domestic disputes. But now he straightened his shoulders. "Do you wish to accept the Duke's invitation?" he asked Charlotte quietly. Charlotte hesitated. "Yes, father. I believe I do." Lord Edmund nodded slowly. "Then you shall accept. Margaret, the matter is settled." "Settled? It is not settled. This is madness." "Amelia is not the one the Duke asked for," Lord Edmund interrupted, steel entering his mild tone. "Charlotte is our daughter as well. She deserves whatever happiness may come her way." The sound of a carriage arriving outside drew everyone's attention. Charlotte moved to the window, her heart leaping. The Thornfield carriage was magnificent, drawn by 4 matched greys, the ducal crest emblazoned on the glossy black door. But what stopped her breath was the sight of the Duke himself descending, tall and unmistakable in charcoal grey. "He has come himself," Lord Edmund observed with approval. "This is unconscionable," Lady Margaret hissed. "Edmund, you must send him away." But it was too late. The front door knocker sounded with authority. Moments later, Alexander Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, was announced into the drawing room. He seemed to fill the space simply by entering. Charlotte watched as her mother attempted to rally, smoothing her skirts. Amelia rose from the sofa, expression calculating. Alexander bowed correctly, but his gaze found Charlotte immediately and remained there, Forgive the intrusion. I realize I am early, but I found myself impatient for Miss Evans's company. Lady Margaret stepped forward, one hand reaching toward Amelia. Your Grace, I believe there has been confusion regarding your invitation. Surely you meant... I meant to invite Miss Charlotte Evans, as stated quite clearly in my message. Alexander interrupted smoothly. He turned to Charlotte's father. Lord Edmund, I trust you have no objection to your daughter accompanying me for a drive. I give you my word as a gentleman that I shall return her safely within the hour. Lord Edmund studied the younger man before nodding. I have no objection, Your Grace. Charlotte is free to accept or decline as she wishes. Miss Evans? Alexander extended his hand toward Charlotte, ignoring Lady Margaret's thunderous expression and Amelia's wounded outrage. Will you join me? Charlotte looked at his offered hand, then at her mother's fury, her sister's hatred, her father's cautious approval, and Mrs. Foster's encouraging smile. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, placing her hand in the Duke's. I would be delighted, Your Grace. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and turned them both toward the door. You cannot be serious, Amelia burst out, abandoning her tragic pose. She is nobody. She has no beauty, no accomplishments worth mentioning. Why would you possibly choose her over me? Alexander paused and looked back at Amelia with cool disdain. Miss Amelia, beauty without kindness is merely decorative, and I have no need for decorations. Then he guided Charlotte out, leaving shocked silence behind. The carriage ride to Hyde Park passed in a blur. Charlotte sat across from Alexander in the plush interior, acutely aware of how his knees nearly brushed her skirts. He had removed his hat, and she could see his dark hair gleaming in filtered sunlight. He watched her with that same intense focus from the ball, as though she were the most fascinating creature he had ever encountered. Your family is not pleased, he observed as they entered the park gates. That is an understatement of considerable proportion, Charlotte replied. Then, before she could stop herself, Your Grace, I must ask why you came in person. Surely your invitation would have sufficed. I suspected your family might attempt to substitute your sister. I wish to make my intentions perfectly clear. But why? The question burst from her. Amelia is everything society values. She is beautiful and accomplished and perfectly suited to be a duchess. I am none of those things. What could you possibly hope to gain? Alexander leaned forward, bringing them closer in the confined space. Do you remember the Pemberton charity concert 2 years ago? Charlotte blinked at the unexpected question. Yes, I suppose so. It was to raise funds for wounded soldiers. You played Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. I arrived late and stood at the back of the hall, unnoticed. I watched you sit at that piano, and for 12 minutes you forgot anyone was watching. You poured your heart into that music, every note reflecting genuine feeling rather than mere technical proficiency. When you finished, there were tears on your cheeks. Charlotte felt heat flooding her face. She remembered that concert, remembered losing herself in the music, but she had no idea anyone had truly noticed. I did not know you were there. I know, Alexander said and smiled. That is precisely what made it so extraordinary. You were not performing for approval or recognition. You were simply being honest, real. And in that moment, I thought I had never seen anything so beautiful in my entire life. Charlotte could not speak. Her throat had closed around words that would not come. Alexander reached across and took her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles through her glove. I am exhausted by artifice, Miss Evans. By women who say what they think I wish to hear, who mold themselves into whatever shape they believe will catch my interest. For 10 years I have endured the marriage market, and every encounter has felt like a business transaction devoid of genuine feeling. His blue eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. Then I saw you in that ballroom, hiding behind columns and trying to be invisible, and I saw the same honest soul I glimpsed at that concert. That is what I am pursuing, Charlotte. Not a perfect duchess for public display, but a real woman with whom I might build something authentic. The use of her given name sent a shiver through her. You do not know me, Your Grace. What if the reality disappoints you? Then, I will deal with disappointment. But I would rather risk that than spend my life wondering what might have been. The carriage had entered the fashionable section of Hyde Park, where society gathered to see and be seen. Charlotte watched as heads turned, recognizing the Thornfield crest, craning to see who sat inside. "You are creating a scandal," she observed. "I have the advantage of a title that cannot be stripped and a fortune that makes me largely untouchable. It affords me certain freedoms that I intend to use." They drove in comfortable silence for several minutes. Birds sang in the trees despite the grey weather, creating a backdrop that somehow made their enclosed space feel even more intimate. "May I ask what you are reading currently?" Alexander broke the silence. Charlotte hesitated. "You truly wish to know. I would not ask otherwise. I have been working through Lord Byron's collected works, though my mother considers his poetry inappropriate for unmarried ladies." Alexander's expression lit with genuine interest. "Don Juan? Or the earlier works?" "Both, actually. I find his treatment of isolation and exile fascinating, even when I disagree with his conclusions." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary 30 minutes of Charlotte's life. They discussed poetry, philosophy, the political situation in Europe, the merits of various novelists. Alexander listened to her opinions with genuine attention, challenged her when he disagreed, and built upon her ideas with observations of his own. He did not condescend or dismiss. He simply conversed as though her thoughts held value. Charlotte felt something unfolding inside her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "Your Grace," she said, as the carriage turned back toward Mayfair, "I must confess something troubles me. You could have any woman in England. Women with fortunes and connections and beauty that I will never possess. It seems improbable that you would settle for someone so thoroughly ordinary." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte, do you believe yourself to be ordinary? I am not fishing for compliments. I am simply stating facts. I have a mirror. I know what I am. You know what society has told you that you are. There is a difference." He leaned back, his gaze never leaving her face. "I am weary of beautiful women who bore me within 5 minutes of conversation. I am tired of accomplished ladies whose accomplishments extend only to those skills deemed appropriate for attracting husbands. I want someone who thinks, who feels, who questions rather than simply agreeing with whatever I say. That quality is extraordinarily rare, Charlotte, and I will not apologize for recognizing its value." The carriage drew to a stop outside the Evans townhouse. Alexander descended first and offered his hand to help her down. For a moment, they stood close together on the pavement, his hand still clasping hers. "May I call on you again?" he asked quietly. "Your Grace, my family will make it extraordinarily difficult. My mother will attempt to push Amelia at you at every opportunity, and society will judge you harshly for this choice." "That is not an answer to my question." Charlotte looked up at him, this impossibly handsome duke who claimed to see value in her ordinary self. She thought of the conversation they had just shared, the way he had listened as though her words mattered. "Yes," she said softly. "You may call again." His smile transformed his entire face. He bowed over her hand, his lips brushing her glove. "Until tomorrow, then." Charlotte had barely entered the house when the interrogation began. Her mother demanded details, Amelia accused her of manipulation, and even her father looked curious. But Charlotte offered only bland pleasantries, keeping the genuine substance of her conversation with Alexander locked safely in her heart. That evening, as Mrs. Foster helped her prepare for bed, Charlotte stared at her reflection and wondered if perhaps she had been mistaken about what she saw there. Not beautiful, certainly, but maybe, just maybe, not quite as invisible as she had always believed. Miles away, in the grand study of Thornfield Manor, Alexander Bellini faced his father's fury. "This is madness!" Lord Henry paced before the fireplace, his face flushed with anger. "The Evans girl has nothing to recommend her. No fortune, no connections, no beauty. You make yourself a laughingstock. I make myself happy," Alexander replied calmly from behind the massive oak desk. "A concept you seem unable to comprehend." "Happy? Happiness is a luxury for those without responsibilities. You are a duke. Your marriage is a matter of dynasty, of alliance, of increasing the family's power and wealth. The Whitmore girl bores me to tears within 5 minutes of conversation, Alexander said flatly, as did every other suitable candidate you have paraded before me for the past decade. Because you are too busy looking for some romantic fantasy that does not exist. Your mother filled your head with nonsense, and look where it got her. Alexander's hands clenched on the desk. Do not speak of my mother in that manner. I will speak however I wish in my own house. This is my house, Alexander corrected coldly, and has been since my majority. You reside here at my pleasure, father. Do not forget that. Lord Henry fell silent, though fury radiated from every line of his body. After a long moment he spoke again, tone slightly more controlled. There are expectations, Alexander, responsibilities. The Thornfield name has stood for 5 centuries. You cannot throw away that legacy on an infatuation with an unremarkable girl. Charlotte Evans brings herself, her mind, her character, her genuine nature. That is worth more to me than all the banking connections in England. You are a fool. Then I am a fool with autonomy over my own choices. I will court Miss Evans. If she accepts me, I will marry her. Your approval is neither required nor requested. Lord Henry stared at his son with an expression caught between rage and something that might have been fear. You will regret this, and when you do not expect my assistance in repairing the damage. I never have, Alexander said quietly. After his father stormed from the room, Alexander moved to the window overlooking the gardens. Rain had stopped, and moonlight broke through clouds, illuminating the carefully maintained grounds. He thought of Charlotte's brown eyes widening with surprise when he mentioned the concert, the way her entire face had lit with enthusiasm when they discussed Byron, the hesitant hope in her voice when she agreed to see him again. His father called it madness. Perhaps it was, but for the first time in years, Alexander felt as though he were finally walking towards something real, rather than simply fulfilling obligations. Charlotte Evans had reminded him what it felt like to be genuinely interested in another person, to anticipate a conversation rather than endure it. He would pursue her, and heaven help anyone who attempted to stand in his way. 2 weeks had passed since that first drive through Hyde Park, and London society buzzed with speculation. Alexander Bellini called upon Miss Charlotte Evans every afternoon without fail. They attended the opera, drove through the park, and engaged in conversations that lasted hours. London society watched with equal parts horror and delight. The Evans household had become a battlefield. Lord Edmund, recognizing the advantage of a ducal connection, supported Charlotte quietly but firmly. Lady Margaret and Amelia oscillated between fury and desperate attempts to insert Amelia into Alexander's line of sight, efforts met with polite indifference. Charlotte sat in the morning room attempting embroidery, while her mother paced like a caged animal. Amelia sprawled on the settee, her face twisted in petulance. "It is unnatural," Lady Margaret declared. "A duke pursuing a girl with nothing to recommend her. He must be simple-minded." "Perhaps he simply knows his own mind," Lord Edmund replied from behind his newspaper. A knock interrupted the tension. The butler entered with an envelope on a silver salver. "A message for Miss Charlotte Evans from Thornfield Manor." Charlotte's hands trembled as she broke the seal. "The Duke requests my presence at a formal dinner at Thornfield Manor tomorrow evening. The entire family is invited." Lady Margaret's expression transformed from fury to calculation. "A dinner at Thornfield. This is our opportunity, Amelia. You will wear your blue silk. We will position you beside the Duke. The invitation specifically requests that I sit at the Duke's right hand," Charlotte said quietly. "Preposterous. You will embarrass us all." "Nevertheless," Lord Edmund interjected, "those are the Duke's wishes, and we will respect them." The following evening, Charlotte stood before her mirror in deep plum silk, while Mrs. Foster made final adjustments. Pearl drops hung from her ears, and her hair had been arranged in a sophisticated style. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Foster said softly. "Not because of the dress, but because you are happy." "I am terrified." "Good. But do not let fear steal your joy. The Thornfield estate was magnificent. A sprawling Jacobean manor of golden stone approached through an avenue of ancient oaks. Alexander waited at the entrance, resplendent in formal attire. His eyes found Charlotte immediately. "You look lovely," he murmured, then louder. "Lord Edmund, Lady Margaret, Miss Amelia, welcome to Thornfield." In the drawing room, other guests had assembled. And there, before the fireplace with an expression of cold disapproval, stood Lord Henry Bellini. He watched Charlotte with obvious disdain as formal introductions proceeded with excruciating politeness. At dinner, Charlotte found herself at Alexander's right hand, as promised, with Lord Henry directly across, positioned to observe her every move. Amelia had been placed further down, her face flushed with humiliation. As the fish course was served, Lord Henry struck. "Miss Charlotte, I understand you have had a governess's education. Tell me, did your studies include finishing school on the continent? Paris, perhaps? Vienna?" Charlotte set down her fork. "No, Lord Henry. My education was conducted entirely at home." "How provincial! And your languages? Surely you speak French fluently." "I read French adequately, but I have never had occasion to speak it conversationally." "Read it adequately," Lord Henry repeated distastefully. "And Italian? German? The languages any properly educated young lady should command?" "Father!" Alexander's voice cut like a whip. "This is hardly appropriate dinner conversation. I am simply getting to know our guest." "And what of music, Miss Charlotte? Extensive training on the pianoforte?" Charlotte felt every eye upon her. "I play, but I have never studied with a continental master." "I see." Each question was a calculated strike, exposing gaps in Charlotte's education. Lady Margaret watched with barely concealed glee. Alexander set down his glass with enough force to make crystal ring. "Tell me, Miss Charlotte, have you finished Lord Byron's collected works? I believe you were in the middle of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage." Charlotte turned to him, grateful. "I have, Your Grace. I found his treatment of isolation particularly moving, though I disagreed with his conclusions about society's capacity for redemption. Interesting. Wordsworth would argue that nature provides redemption. Do you agree? I think Wordsworth romanticizes isolation too much. He forgets that humans are inherently social creatures. True redemption must come through connection with others, not escape from them." The conversation flowed naturally, touching on philosophy and literature. Charlotte forgot her nervousness, forgot Lord Henry's hostile gaze, forgot everything except genuine intellectual discourse. Other guests contributed observations, and what had started as rescue transformed into sophisticated exchange that dominated the remainder of dinner. When the ladies withdrew, Charlotte's earlier humiliation had faded. She had held her own through the quality of her mind and authenticity of her perspective. In the drawing room, Amelia cornered Charlotte near the windows. "You think you are so clever, discussing books as though you are his equal. But you are not. You are a spinster with nothing to offer. Eventually he will see that, and I will be waiting. And what will you offer, Amelia? Beauty, grace, an appropriate Duchess. You may have captured his attention temporarily, but attention fades. Beauty endures. Does it? Because your beauty has not won you the Duke. Perhaps there are things more valuable than a pretty face." Alexander approached, offering his arm. "Would you care to see the conservatory?" They walked through quiet corridors until they reached glass doors opening onto an enclosed garden space. The conservatory was magnificent, soaring glass and wrought iron filled with exotic plants. Moonlight filtered through panels overhead, painting everything silver. "I apologize for my father's behavior," Alexander said once they were alone. "His conduct was inexcusable. He seeks to demonstrate my unsuitability, and he is correct. I lack the education expected of a duchess." "Charlotte," he caught her hand. "Do you truly believe that?" She met his eyes. "I do not know what to believe anymore. 2 weeks ago, I was invisible. Now I am the center of a storm. Your father despises me. My own mother would prefer I disappear. And you—" She trailed off. I do not understand why you persist. You could have any woman in England. Why choose someone who brings you only scandal and difficulty?" Alexander was quiet, then led her to a bench beneath a towering palm. They sat, shoulders touching. "My mother was a merchant's daughter," he said. "My father married her for her fortune to repair the estates. It was business. But they found something real. After she died when I was 15, something in my father broke. He became obsessed with restoring reputation, erasing any trace of the merchant connection. He molded me into the perfect aristocrat, designed for an advantageous match." Charlotte listened in silence. "I was prepared to fulfill that destiny, to marry whichever appropriate young lady my father selected and live in comfortable emptiness. Then I heard you play piano, saw you at that ball, and remembered what my mother's journals described. The possibility of something real." He cupped her cheek. "I pursue you because you make me feel alive, because conversation with you stimulates rather than deadens my mind, because your honesty is rare and precious, and because when I imagine my future, I cannot picture it without you." Charlotte felt tears burning. "I am so afraid. Afraid I will fail you, prove unequal to your world." His thumb brushed her lips. "Then we will fail together. But I would rather face that than pretend this thing between us does not exist." They were close now, his breath against her face. The moment stretched, suspended and precious. Alexander's head bent toward hers, his eyes drifting closed, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. The conservatory door crashed open. A footman stood in the doorway, breathing hard. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but an urgent message has arrived. The messenger insists it cannot wait." Alexander closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident. "Very well. Have him meet me in my study." He turned to Charlotte, helping her up. "I apologize. Our moments keep being interrupted. Perhaps the universe is trying to tell us something. Then the universe will have to try harder." They returned to the drawing room where guests were preparing to depart. Lady Margaret watched their entrance with narrowed eyes while Amelia looked murderous. Later, after returning home, Charlotte lay awake replaying every moment, wondering about that urgent message. At Thornfield Manor, Alexander stood in his study reading an official document, his father across from him. "The Council of Ducal Oversight," Alexander said flatly. "You have petitioned them to review my competence, citing evidence of undue influence and decisions made while in an impaired mental state. It is for your own good," Lord Henry replied. "You are clearly not thinking rationally. The Council will determine you require guidance in personal matters and appoint advisors to oversee your marriage negotiations. You would have me declared incompetent? Stripped of autonomy? Only in matters of marriage. The Thornfield name is too important to be damaged by your temporary madness. Do not presume to speak for my mother. She would have been horrified by your actions. She would have been horrified by yours. Pursuing a nobody, embarrassing yourself, throwing away centuries of breeding." Alexander carefully set down the document. "You have 3 days to withdraw this petition. If you do not, I will fight it with every resource at my disposal. And win or lose, our relationship will be severed permanently. Choose carefully." He walked out without waiting for response, leaving his father alone. Lord Henry sat in silence, staring at the closed door, wondering if he had pushed too far. But the petition had been filed, the wheels set in motion. The council would convene within the week to determine whether Alexander Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, was fit to make his own choices. And Charlotte Evans, sleeping peacefully, had no idea that a legal battle for Alexander's autonomy and their future was about to begin. The crisis descended upon Charlotte's life like a sudden winter storm, brutal and inescapable. 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated separation from Alexander. 3 weeks of watching her world fracture along fault lines she had not known existed. The Council of Ducal Oversight had convened with terrifying speed, and London society held its collective breath, waiting to see if the Duke of Thornfield would be stripped of his autonomy in matters of marriage. Charlotte sat in the morning room, a letter from Alexander clutched in her trembling hands. It had arrived by private messenger, carefully avoiding her mother's interception. His words were measured, controlled, but she could sense the fury and frustration beneath the formal language. "My dearest Charlotte," it began, "the Council has ordered that we cease all contact during the review process. Any attempt to communicate may be used as evidence of my supposed incompetence. I write this in defiance of their order because you deserve to know the truth. My father has presented them with a case built on lies and manipulation, arguing that my interest in you represents a mental deterioration that threatens the Thornfield legacy. The hearings begin next week. Whatever happens, know that my regard for you has not wavered. Yours, Alexander. Mrs. Foster entered quietly, closing the door behind her. Your mother is planning to attend Lady Pemberton's tea this afternoon. She intends to spread the news that you and the Duke have parted ways, that his momentary madness has been corrected by wiser heads. Charlotte looked up at her former governess, her jaw set with uncharacteristic determination. Then my mother will be proven a liar. Moi. She rose, crossing to the writing desk and pulling out fresh paper. Mrs. Foster, you once mentioned that your brother works as a counter for various noble families. Is that still true? Mrs. Foster's eyes widened with understanding. Thomas? Yes, he maintains accounts for several estates. Why do you ask? Because Lord Henry's accusations rest on the assumption that Alexander's choice is irrational, without logical foundation. But what if Lord Henry himself is acting not from concern for his son, but from financial desperation? What if there is evidence that he planned to use Alexander's marriage as a solution to his own debts? That would be a serious allegation, Charlotte. Yes, Charlotte agreed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. It would. Can you arrange a meeting with your brother, discreetly? Mrs. Foster studied her former charge, seeing not the timid girl who had hidden behind columns at balls, but a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. I can. But Charlotte, if you pursue this and fail, the consequences will be severe. Your reputation, such as it is, will be destroyed completely. My reputation is already destroyed, Charlotte replied. Society has made up its mind about me. But Alexander's future, his autonomy, his right to make his own choices, those things are worth fighting for. Will you help me? Mrs. Foster smiled, a fierce expression that transformed her normally placid features. I thought you would never ask. The meeting with Thomas Foster took place 2 days later in a discreet coffee house, far from the fashionable districts where Charlotte might be recognized. Thomas was a spare man of middle years, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his days examining ledgers for inconsistencies. He listened to Charlotte's questions with increasing interest, occasionally making notes in a small book he produced from his coat pocket. Lord Henry Bellini, he said thoughtfully, stirring his coffee. I do not handle his accounts personally, but I know the man who does, and I know the rumours that circulate among those of us who work in the financial trades. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Lord Henry has substantial gambling debts. Cards primarily, though also horse racing. He has been liquidating assets quietly for the past year to cover losses. Charlotte's pulse quickened. Could these debts have motivated him to arrange an advantageous marriage for his son? Without question, a large dowry or a bride with significant financial connections would solve his immediate problems. Thomas paused, considering. There was talk, some months ago, of negotiations with the Whitmore family. Lady Victoria Whitmore, the banking heiress. Her father was apparently open to a match with the Duke of Thornfield and was prepared to offer a substantial settlement. Do you have any proof of these negotiations? Documents? Correspondence? Thomas shook his head. Nothing I could access legally, but he hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. There is a clerk in the Whitmore household who is indebted to me for a past favour. He might be willing to search their private correspondence for evidence of such an arrangement, if it exists. Please, Charlotte said urgently. Ask him. Whatever the cost, I will find a way to pay it. There will be no cost, Thomas replied firmly. My sister speaks very highly of you, Miss Evans, and I have little patience for powerful men who manipulate the law to serve their own ends. The next 10 days passed in a blur of anxiety and covert activity. Charlotte maintained the appearance of defeated acceptance, allowing her mother to believe she had given up on Alexander. She attended the appropriate social functions, endured Amelia's gloating comments, and said nothing about the documents slowly accumulating in a locked drawer in her bedchamber. Thomas Foster proved extraordinarily resourceful. Through his network of clerks and account keepers, he obtained copies of correspondence between Lord Henry and the Whitmore family, dated to the months before Alexander had met Charlotte. The letters detailed negotiations for a marriage contract, including specific financial arrangements that would have seen a substantial portion of Lady Victoria's dowry applied directly to Lord Henry's outstanding debts. There were also records of Lord Henry's gambling losses, carefully documented by the establishments where he had incurred them. "This is enough," Mrs. Foster said, examining the documents spread across Charlotte's bed. "This proves Lord Henry had financial motivation to control Alexander's choice of bride." "It is enough to raise questions," Charlotte agreed. "But will it be enough to sway the council? They are powerful men, accustomed to protecting their own interests. Why would they believe me over Lord Henry? Because you will present these facts calmly and rationally, demonstrating exactly the kind of clear thinking that Lord Henry claims Alexander lacks." Mrs. Foster squeezed Charlotte's hand. "You are stronger than you believe, child. Trust in that strength." The final hearing of the Council of Ducal Oversight was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at Whitehall, in one of the formal chambers used for matters of noble privilege and responsibility. Charlotte was not invited, of course. The proceedings were closed to all but the Duke, his father, and the 5 council members who would render judgment. Charlotte attended anyway. She dressed with care that morning, choosing a gown of deep navy that conveyed seriousness, without sacrificing respectability. Mrs. Foster arranged her hair in a severe style that emphasized the intelligence in her brown eyes, rather than attempting to soften her features into conventional prettiness. Charlotte looked in the mirror and saw not the invisible spinster who had hidden at balls, but a woman with purpose and determination. "Are you certain about this?" Mrs. Foster asked as they prepared to leave. "Once you step through those doors, there will be no going back." "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." The journey to Whitehall seemed to take both an eternity and no time at all. Charlotte's hands trembled as she clutched the leather portfolio containing her carefully assembled evidence. Lord Edmund had provided his carriage without questions, sensing perhaps that his eldest daughter had finally found her courage and choosing to support it rather than quash it. The corridor outside the council chamber was quiet, lined with portraits of former ministers and nobility who stared down with painted disapproval. Charlotte could hear voices from within, Alexander's among them, steady but strained as he defended his choices before men who held his future in their hands. 2 guards stood at the door, positioned to prevent unauthorized entry. They looked at Charlotte with obvious skepticism as she approached. "The council is in closed session," one said formally. "No visitors are permitted." "I am not a visitor," Charlotte replied, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "I am Miss Charlotte Evans, and I have evidence pertinent to these proceedings. Evidence that the council must see before rendering judgment. The council hears only from authorized parties." "Then authorize me," Charlotte interrupted. "Or explain to them later why you prevented crucial information from reaching their consideration. I somehow doubt they will thank you for that decision." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Before they could respond, the door opened from within, and a clerk emerged with a stack of documents tucked beneath his arm. One guard stepped into his path. "Sir," the guard said quietly, nodding toward Charlotte, "this lady insists she has evidence for the council." The clerk's gaze moved from her navy gown to the sealed packet in her hands. He looked unimpressed, but not indifferent. "A submission?" he asked. "Evidence," Charlotte replied evenly, "pertinent to Lord Henry Thornfield's petition and to the Duke's. It must be entered before they decide." The clerk hesitated, then accepted the packet with a faint frown. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared back into the chamber. A moment later, the door opened wider. "Miss Evans," Lord Ashworth's severe voice called from within. "If you truly carry material evidence, you will present it now, under guard." Charlotte stepped into the chamber with measured composure, the 2 guards following at a respectful distance. The council chamber was all dark wood panelling and serious faces. 5 men sat at an elevated table, their expressions ranging from surprise to irritation at the interruption. Lord Henry stood to one side, his face purpling with fury. And there, At the center of it all stood Alexander, who turned at the commotion and froze when he saw Charlotte. Lord Ashworth, the council's chairman, fixed Charlotte with a severe stare. "You have asked leave to interrupt our session," he said. "State your purpose, briefly." "My lords," Charlotte said, keeping her voice steady as she offered the sealed packet to the clerk, "I have evidence that bears directly upon this petition and Lord Henry Thornfield's motives in pursuing it. I ask that it be entered into the record before you render judgment." "This is outrageous," Lord Henry sputtered. "She has no right to be here. She is the source of my son's irrational behavior. Then surely you have nothing to fear from her testimony," Alexander said quietly, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. Something like hope and terror warred in his expression. Lord Ashworth raised a hand for silence. "This is highly irregular, Miss Evans. Proceed. Quickly." "I am Charlotte Evans, my lord," she said. She moved forward, placing the portfolio on the table before the council. "I have documentation here that demonstrates Lord Henry's substantial gambling debts, as well as correspondence detailing his negotiations with the Whitmore family for a marriage contract that would have used a significant portion of Lady Victoria Whitmore's dowry to settle those debts." The chamber fell silent. Lord Ashworth opened the portfolio, his expression growing more severe as he examined the contents. He passed documents to the other council members, who read with increasing interest. "These appear to be authentic," Lord Ashworth said finally. "Lord Henry, can you explain these?" "Private financial matters have no bearing on my son's mental competence." Lord Henry's voice had risen to near shouting. "On the contrary," Charlotte said, her confidence growing as she saw the council's attention focused on her words. "They have every bearing. You argue that the Duke's interest in me represents irrational decision-making, evidence of mental deterioration. But these documents suggest an alternative explanation, that your son has simply refused to make the financially convenient choice that would solve your gambling debts, and you have used this council as a weapon to force compliance." "How dare you!" Lord Henry started forward, but guards moved to restrain him. Charlotte turned to address the full council. "My lords, I am not a suitable match by conventional standards. I bring no fortune, no powerful connections, no exceptional beauty. Lord Henry is correct about those facts. But the Duke of Thornfield is 9 and 20 years of age, has demonstrated exceptional competence in managing his estates and business affairs, and possesses full legal majority. If you determine him incompetent to choose his own bride, simply because that choice does not align with his father's financial interests, then you set a dangerous precedent." She took a breath, channeling every ounce of courage she possessed. "You suggest that any nobleman who marries for affection rather than advantage must be mentally deficient. You imply that genuine feeling is evidence of madness rather than humanity. If that is your judgment, then half the peers in England should be declared incompetent, for I suspect many of them harbour private preferences that do not align with perfect political calculation." Lord Montague, one of the younger council members, leaned forward. "You speak very eloquently for someone who supposedly lacks proper education, Miss Evans. I have had an excellent governess and access to a well-stocked library, my lord. That may not be equivalent to continental finishing schools, but it has taught me to think critically and express myself clearly. Skills that should not be devalued simply because they were not acquired in fashionable venues." "This is absurd," Lord Henry interjected desperately. "She has bewitched him. This is exactly the kind of manipulation—" "Father." Alexander's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. He had not spoken since Charlotte's entrance, but now he stepped forward. "Enough. Miss Evans is correct. Your petition has nothing to do with my welfare and everything to do with your gambling debts. I have known about them for months. I also know about your arrangement with the Whitmores, which I refused explicitly because I would not allow my marriage to be used as a financial instrument for your benefit." He turned to face the council directly. "My lords, I am aware that my father's accusations paint me as mentally unsound, incapable of rational judgment. I submit that the evidence before you tells a different story. A man in the grip of mental deterioration does not successfully increase his estate's revenues by 40% over 5 years. He does not negotiate favorable trade agreements or manage complex business interests across 3 countries. He does not maintain cordial relationships with colleagues and clear-headed decision-making in every area of his life, except one. The exception being your choice of bride, Lord Ashworth observed. The exception being the one choice my father cannot control, Alexander corrected. I have fulfilled every duty required of my position. I have managed the Thornfield estates responsibly, maintained appropriate relationships with fellow peers, and conducted myself with proper decorum. The only evidence of my supposed incompetence is that I have chosen to court a woman my father does not approve of. If that is sufficient grounds for the council to strip a man of autonomy, then none of us are truly free. The council members exchanged glances. Lord Ashworth studied the documents before him for a long moment before speaking. Miss Evans, you have presented serious allegations against Lord Henry. These documents appear authentic, and they raise significant questions about the motivations behind this petition. He turned to Lord Henry. Do you deny that you have substantial gambling debts? Or that you negotiated with the Whitmore family regarding a marriage contract? Lord Henry's face had gone from purple to ashen. The financial arrangements of the Thornfield estate are complex. Certain investments required capital, and the Whitmore alliance would have been mutually beneficial. That is not an answer to my question. I do not deny the existence of financial obligations, Lord Henry said stiffly. But that does not change the fact that my son is making an irrational choice. Irrational by whose standard? Lord Montague asked. By yours, because it does not serve your financial interests. The deliberation lasted less than 10 minutes. When the council reconvened, Lord Ashworth's expression was stern. The council finds insufficient evidence to support the petition for oversight, he announced. Alexander Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, retains full autonomy over his personal affairs, including matters of marriage. Furthermore, this council formally reprimands Lord Henry Bellini for bringing a petition motivated by private financial interest rather than genuine concern for his son's welfare. This matter is closed. The chamber erupted. Lord Henry stood frozen, the full weight of his defeat and public humiliation settling over him. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, relief visible in every line of his body. And Charlotte, still standing before the council table, felt her knees begin to buckle as the adrenaline that had sustained her finally ebbed away. Alexander reached her in 3 long strides, catching her arm to steady her. Charlotte, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. What have you done? What needed to be done? She replied, looking up at him. You once told me you valued honesty and courage. I thought it was time I demonstrated both. His hand tightened on her arm, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might embrace her right there before the council and guards and his humiliated father. Instead, he turned to Lord Ashworth. My lords, I request permission to escort Miss Evans from the chamber. The proceedings have concluded, and she should not have to endure further scrutiny. Lord Ashworth nodded. Permission granted. Miss Evans, you have shown remarkable courage today. I suspect you will make an interesting Duchess, should the Duke's courtship reach its natural conclusion. Charlotte curtsied, her legs still unsteady. Thank you, my lord. Alexander guided her from the chamber, his hand never leaving her arm. They passed Lord Henry without speaking, though Charlotte felt the weight of his hatred like a physical blow. In the corridor, away from witnesses, Alexander finally stopped and turned to face her. You should not have done that, he said, but his voice held no anger, only wonder. You risked everything, your reputation, your standing, whatever fragile social position you had managed to maintain. I risked nothing I was not prepared to lose, Charlotte replied. And I could not stand by while your father attempted to steal your autonomy. Not when I had the means to stop him. How did you even obtain those documents? Mrs. Foster's brother is an account keeper. He has connections throughout the financial trades. Charlotte smiled slightly. It seems that even invisible spinsters can be resourceful when properly motivated. Alexander laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. Then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, despite the impropriety. Charlotte felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt the tension slowly draining from his body. I thought I had lost you, he murmured into her hair. These 3 weeks have been torture, knowing you were forbidden from me, wondering if the council would rule against us. You have not lost me, Charlotte said softly. Though you may regret that, once society finishes discussing today's events. He pulled back just enough to look down at her face. Let them discuss. I have my autonomy. You have proven yourself extraordinary, and my father has been publicly rebuked. I would call that a victory. They stood there in the quiet corridor, holding each other as the weight of the past weeks finally lifted. Charlotte knew that challenges remained. Lord Henry's hatred would not fade simply because he had been defeated. Her own family would be scandalized by her bold action, and society would have fresh material for gossip that would last the remainder of the season. But for this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was Alexander's arms around her, solid and warm and real. What mattered was that they had fought for each other and won. Everything else they would face together. Victory came with a price that Charlotte had not fully anticipated. The council's ruling freed Alexander from his father's legal machinations, but it also unleashed consequences that rippled through London society like stones thrown into still water. Lord Henry Bellini departed Thornfield Manor within 48 hours of the council's decision, retreating to a remote estate in Yorkshire without farewell or reconciliation. The servants whispered that he had packed his belongings in cold fury, ordering his valet to remove every trace of his presence from rooms he had occupied for decades. Alexander said nothing about his father's departure, but Charlotte saw the pain in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The grief of a son who had been forced to choose between his own autonomy and his father's approval. London society fractured along predictable lines. The older, more traditional families viewed Charlotte's intervention at the council as scandalous, an inappropriate display of female ambition that had no place in proper society. They muttered about upstart girls who overreached their station, about dukes who had lost their minds, about the deterioration of proper standards. These families closed their doors to both Charlotte and Alexander, their disapproval expressed through pointed exclusions from guest lists and cut direct encounters on the street. But there were others, particularly among the younger set and those who had grown weary of rigid social hierarchies, who found the entire affair romantic and admirable. They spoke in drawing rooms about Charlotte's courage, about Alexander's steadfast devotion, about the triumph of genuine feeling over mercenary calculation. These families extended invitations, curiosity and approval mingling in equal measure. The Evans household became a pressure cooker of conflicting emotions. Lord Edmund, vindicated in his support of Charlotte, walked with a new confidence. He had backed the right horse, so to speak, and soon the Duke of Thornfield would be his son-in-law, securing the family's position in ways that Amelia's beauty never could have achieved. He treated Charlotte with a warmth she had not experienced since childhood, discussing her future as though she had finally become visible to him. But Lady Margaret and Amelia descended into a fury so pure and sustained that the household staff learned to walk on eggshells. The morning Charlotte returned from the council hearing, flushed with victory and Alexander's gratitude, her mother had greeted her with a slap that left a red handprint on her cheek. "You have ruined us," Lady Margaret hissed. "Ruined your sister's prospects, made our family a laughingstock, and for what? So you could trap a duke through manipulation and lies?" "I trapped no one, Mother. I presented the truth." "The truth?" Lady Margaret laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you are a plain, awkward girl who should have been grateful for whatever match we could arrange for you. Instead, you have reached above your station and dragged us all down with your ambition." Amelia said nothing during that initial confrontation, but her silence was more frightening than her mother's rage. She watched Charlotte with calculating eyes, and Charlotte knew with certainty that her sister was planning something, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The retaliation began subtly. Lady Margaret and Amelia launched a coordinated campaign of whispered insinuations that spread through drawing rooms and tea parties like poison in a water supply. They suggested that Charlotte had used inappropriate methods to ensnare the Duke, that she had somehow manipulated or bewitched him. They spoke of unseemly ambition, of a plain girl who had schemed her way into a position far above her natural place. "I heard she studied dark arts," one gossip reported to another, who reported it to a third. "That she learned techniques from her governess, who everyone knows was once involved in a scandal involving a married gentleman. Her sister is the real beauty of the family, you know. Poor Miss Amelia, overshadowed by schemes and manipulation." The Duke will realize his error eventually. Men always do when the initial enchantment wears thin. Charlotte heard the whispers at every event she attended. She felt the cold shoulders, saw the way groups of women would fall silent when she approached and resumed conversation, only after she had passed. It was social ostracism of the most calculated variety, designed to make her invisible once more, to remind her that she did not truly belong in the elevated circles she now attempted to inhabit. Alexander stood by her through it all, his presence a shield against the worst of society's cruelty. He attended every event at her side, his hand warm and steady on her arm, his attention focused entirely on her, as though the gossiping crowd simply did not exist. But Charlotte saw the strain it caused him, the way his jaw would tighten when he overheard particularly vicious comments, the anger that flashed in his blue eyes when women cut Charlotte directly in his presence. "Perhaps we should withdraw from society for a time," Charlotte suggested one afternoon as they drove through Hyde Park. "Allow the scandal to fade before we attempt to navigate these social waters." "We will do no such thing," Alexander replied firmly. "That is precisely what they want, for us to hide away in shame. We have nothing to be ashamed of, Charlotte. We will continue exactly as we have been." But the tension built with each passing day, each whispered insult, each pointed exclusion. Charlotte felt herself withdrawing despite her best efforts, the old instinct to make herself small and invisible reasserting itself. She began declining invitations, claiming headaches or fatigue, until Alexander appeared at her door one morning with a determined expression. "Lady Rothwell is hosting a ball tonight," he said without preamble. "We are attending together, and you will hold your head high. I will not allow them to break your spirit, Charlotte. You are stronger than that." The Rothwell Ball was the social event of the week, attended by everyone who mattered in London society. Charlotte dressed with Mrs. Foster's help, choosing a gown of deep coral silk that brought unexpected warmth to her complexion. She wore her grandmother's pearls and allowed Mrs. Foster to arrange her hair in an elegant style that emphasized her brown eyes. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Foster said, meeting Charlotte's gaze in the mirror. "Remember that when they try to make you feel otherwise. Remember what you have accomplished and who stands beside you." The ballroom at Rothwell House blazed with candlelight and music. Charlotte entered on Alexander's arm, feeling the immediate shift in the room's energy as heads turned to observe them. The whispers started immediately, a susurrus of speculation and judgment that followed them like a shadow. Alexander led her to the edge of the dance floor, where several couples were engaged in a country dance. They stood together, presenting a united front, though Charlotte's hands trembled in her gloves. "Miss Evans," Lady Pemberton approached with false warmth. "How delightful to see you. Though I confess, I am surprised you chose to attend tonight. I would have thought, given the circumstances, that a quieter evening might have been more appropriate." "I cannot imagine what circumstances you refer to, Lady Pemberton," Charlotte replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "The Duke and I are simply enjoying the season like anyone else." Of course, Lady Pemberton's smile sharpened, "though one does hear such interesting stories. Tell me, is it true that your former governess was dismissed from a previous position under scandalous circumstances?" "I heard the most intriguing tale." Alexander stepped forward, his expression cold. "Lady Pemberton, I find myself suddenly weary of interesting tales. Perhaps you might direct your interest toward more productive subjects." Lady Pemberton flushed and retreated, but the damage was done. Charlotte felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. Around them, other guests watched with avid curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. Then Amelia appeared, resplendent in pale blue silk that showcased her golden beauty to perfection. She glided through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, drawing admiring glances and warm greetings. She positioned herself near Charlotte and Alexander with deliberate precision. "Charlotte, dearest sister," Amelia said, her voice carrying clearly. "I have been searching for you everywhere. Mother sent me to remind you about that spot on your gown, the one near the hem. She thought you might want to repair it before anyone else notices." Charlotte glanced down instinctively, though she knew there was no spot. It was a calculated move, designed to make her examine herself in front of witnesses, to plant the suggestion of carelessness or poverty in observers' minds. "I see no spot, Amelia." "Oh, perhaps it was just the lighting at home," Amelia replied sweetly. She turned to accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman, her movements graceful and controlled. "You know how difficult it can be to see imperfections in certain fabrics. Coral can be so unforgiving." The conversation continued around them, but Charlotte felt herself shrinking inward, the old instinct to flee rising in her chest. She was about to suggest to Alexander that they leave when Amelia made her move. It happened so quickly that Charlotte barely registered the motion. Amelia turned, her arm sweeping outward as though emphasizing a point, and her wineglass tilted. Dark claret cascaded directly onto Charlotte's coral silk gown, bleeding across the fabric in a spreading stain and seeping down to the layers beneath. "Oh!" Amelia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in theatrical horror. "Charlotte, I'm so terribly sorry. How clumsy of me. Look what I have done to your lovely gown." The nearby guests fell silent, attention riveted on the scene. Charlotte stood frozen, champagne dripping from her skirts, humiliation burning through her veins. She could hear the whispers starting already, see the barely concealed satisfaction on her sister's face. "Perhaps you should retire to repair the damage," Amelia continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "I know how embarrassing these accidents can be. No one would blame you for leaving early." Lady Margaret materialized from the crowd, her expression suggesting she had been waiting nearby for exactly this moment. "Charlotte, come with me immediately. We must see to your gown before the stain sets. Really, you should have been more careful. Standing so close when your sister was holding champagne, anyone could have predicted this outcome." Charlotte looked down at her ruined gown, then up at her mother's calculating expression and her sister's barely concealed triumph. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The public humiliation that would cement her position as the awkward, unfortunate sister who had temporarily deluded a duke, but would ultimately be revealed as unworthy. The tears she had been holding back for weeks burned behind her eyes. She opened her mouth to excuse herself, to flee to the ladies' retiring room, and perhaps straight out of the ball entirely, when Alexander's voice cut through the silence. "Miss Amelia." His tone was ice over steel. "That was remarkably well executed. Tell me, have you been practicing that particular maneuver, or did it simply come naturally?" Amelia's expression faltered. "Your Grace, it was an accident." "Of course it was." Alexander's smile held no warmth. "Just as all the whispered rumours have been accidents. Just as every cut and slight directed at Miss Charlotte has been accidental. London society is apparently filled with the most unfortunate series of accidents I have ever witnessed." He turned to face the crowd that had gathered, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I find I can no longer remain silent in the face of behaviour that would shame schoolchildren. For weeks, I have watched a woman of remarkable courage and integrity face cruelty from those who should know better. I have heard whispers and insinuations from people who possess neither her honesty nor her strength of character, and I have reached my limit." The ballroom had gone utterly silent. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, musicians frozen mid-note. Alexander knelt. The gesture was so unexpected, so shocking in its public intimacy, that gasps echoed through the crowd. He went down on one knee before Charlotte, there in the centre of the Rothwell ballroom, champagne staining her gown and tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. And he looked up at her with an expression of such tenderness that Charlotte forgot how to breathe. "Miss Charlotte Evans," he said clearly, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was doing. "I have spent the past weeks watching you face adversity with a grace and dignity that humbles me. You have been mocked, ostracized, and deliberately humiliated by people who are not fit to polish your shoes. You have endured whispers about your appearance, your education, your worthiness, all while maintaining your composure and kindness. You are, without question, the most courageous woman I have ever known." He reached into his coat and produced a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring that caught the candlelight and sent it scattering in rainbow prisms. "This ring belonged to my mother. She wore it on the day she married my father, in a ceremony that society judged harshly because she was not born to their standards. But my mother taught me that true nobility has nothing to do with birth or breeding. It is measured in courage, in kindness, in the strength to remain true to oneself despite opposition." Charlotte could not stop the tears now. They spilled down her cheeks as Alexander continued, his eyes never leaving her face. "You possess that nobility, Charlotte. You have demonstrated it again and again, and I would be honored, profoundly honored, if you would consent to be my wife, to stand beside me, not as a duchess performing a role, but as my partner, my equal, the woman who reminds me every day what it means to live with integrity and courage." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Charlotte was aware of hundreds of eyes upon them, of her mother's shocked expression, of Amelia's face draining of colour. But all of that faded to insignificance compared to the man kneeling before her, offering her his heart and his name with a vulnerability that took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He rose in one fluid motion, taking her left hand and sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting all these years for her specifically. Then, before the assembled crowd, before her family and his enemies, and every gossip in London, Alexander Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, pulled Charlotte Evans into his arms and kissed her. The ballroom erupted. Applause mixed with shocked exclamations, approval blending with scandal. Charlotte heard none of it, lost in the sensation of Alexander's lips on hers, the strength of his arms around her, the way her heart seemed to expand in her chest, until she thought it might burst. When they finally parted, Charlotte saw Amelia swaying on her feet, her face white as chalk. Then, with theatrical precision, her sister crumpled to the floor in a dead faint. Lady Margaret rushed to her side, calling for smelling salts and assistance. But the attention had already shifted away from Amelia's performance. Lord Edmund pushed through the crowd, his expression caught between shock and satisfaction. He looked at his eldest daughter, standing in her champagne-stained gown with a duke's ring on her finger, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Your Grace," he said, extending his hand to Alexander, "I believe congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Lord Edmund." Alexander shook his hand firmly, then turned back to Charlotte, his arms sliding possessively around her waist. "Though I believe I am the one who should be congratulated. Your daughter has agreed to spend her life with me, despite having every reason to refuse." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Well-wishers surrounded them, some genuine, others merely seeking to align themselves with the winning side, now that the Duke had made his choice so publicly and irrevocably. Charlotte's ruined gown became a badge of honour rather than a mark of shame, the stain a visible reminder of the pettiness that had preceded Alexander's dramatic proposal. Lady Margaret and Amelia left early, the latter still claiming faintness, though Charlotte suspected it was more humiliation than actual illness. Her mother's expression as she departed promised that this battle was far from over, but for once Charlotte found she did not care. Let them plot and scheme. They had already deployed their worst weapons, and she had survived. As Alexander drove her home in his carriage hours later, Charlotte looked down at the ring on her finger, still scarcely believing what had transpired. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. "The public proposal, the declaration before all of society. You could have simply asked me privately." "I could have," Alexander agreed. "But then they would have continued to treat you as something shameful, something I was reluctantly accepting. I wanted there to be absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that you are my choice, deliberately and proudly made, that I consider myself fortunate beyond measure that you accepted me." Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, exhaustion and happiness mingling, until she could barely distinguish one from the other. "I love you," she said, the words surprising even herself with their simplicity and truth. Alexander's arm tightened around her. "And I love you, Charlotte Evans. Soon to be Charlotte Bellini, Duchess of Thornfield, and the woman who taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand firm despite it." The scandal would continue, Charlotte knew. Society would dissect every aspect of their courtship and engagement. Her mother and sister would not cease their campaign simply because they had lost this particular battle, and Alexander's father remained estranged, nursing his wounded pride and rage in Yorkshire. But for this moment, none of that mattered. Charlotte had faced her fears and emerged victorious. She had fought for what she wanted and won, and she had found, in the process, a strength she had never known she possessed. The carriage rolled through London's lamplit streets, carrying them toward a future that would undoubtedly hold challenges. But they would face those challenges together, Duke and soon-to-be Duchess, partners in truth as well as title. And that, Charlotte thought as sleep began to claim her, was worth any amount of scandal. The 3 months between Alexander's dramatic proposal and the wedding date stretched before Charlotte like a gauntlet she must navigate without misstep. The engagement had been formalized with appropriate announcements in the newspapers, and London society now regarded her with a mixture of grudging acceptance and persistent skepticism. She was to become a duchess, but many remained convinced she would prove unequal to the position. The transformation from invisible spinster to future duchess required education that Charlotte had never received. Within days of the engagement, Alexander arranged for a series of tutors to attend her at the Evans townhouse. There was Mrs. Hartwell, a severe woman in her 60s who specialized in teaching aristocratic protocol and the complex hierarchies of noble society. There was Mr. Dubois, a French exile, who attempted to polish Charlotte's serviceable French into something approaching fluency. And there was Lady Ashford, a widowed countess who undertook to teach Charlotte the intricacies of managing multiple estates, overseeing large staffs, and navigating the delicate politics of aristocratic entertaining. The lessons were exhausting and often humiliating. Charlotte sat for hours memorizing the precise order of precedence for seating arrangements at formal dinners, learning which families outranked others and by what margins, understanding the subtle distinctions between various forms of address and courtesy. She practiced walking with books balanced on her head to improve her already adequate posture to the level expected of a duchess. She studied household accounts until numbers swam before her eyes, learning to manage budgets that exceeded anything she had previously imagined. Mrs. Foster remained her constant companion through it all, sitting quietly in corners during lessons, offering encouragement when Charlotte's frustration threatened to overwhelm her, and providing the kind of steady support that only someone who had known her since childhood could offer. "You are doing splendidly, Mrs. Foster said one afternoon after a particularly brutal session with Mrs. Hartwell, who had spent 2 hours correcting Charlotte's pronunciation of various noble family names. "These things take time to master." "I have 3 months," Charlotte replied wearily, rubbing her temples. 3 months to learn what other girls spend years being taught from childhood. "What if I fail, Mrs. Foster? What if I stand beside Alexander at some formal dinner and commit some terrible error of protocol that embarrasses him before all of society? Then you will apologize gracefully and continue," Mrs. Foster said firmly. "Charlotte, you are intelligent and determined. These skills can be learned. What cannot be learned is the quality of character that drew the Duke to you in the first place. Never forget that." Alexander visited as often as his duties allowed, but Charlotte saw him less frequently than she had expected. The Thornfield estates required constant attention, and with his father's departure, the full weight of management had fallen on Alexander's shoulders. He spent days travelling between properties, meeting with stewards and tenants, addressing issues that had been neglected during the drama of the council proceedings. When he did call on Charlotte, he often looked exhausted, his face drawn with the strain of managing both his estates and the social fallout from their unconventional engagement. "I apologize for my absence," he said one evening as they sat in the Evans drawing room under Mrs. Foster's watchful chaperonage. "There are matters at the Derbyshire property that require personal attention, and the London house needs significant repairs before it will be suitable for you." "I understand," Charlotte said, though she felt the creeping loneliness of facing her tutors and trials without his steady presence. Your responsibilities must come first. You are my responsibility now as well, he replied, taking her hand. Do not think I have forgotten that. But these next months will be difficult for both of us, I fear. The social visits began soon after the engagement announcement. Ladies of various ranks called upon Charlotte, ostensibly to offer congratulations, but in reality, to assess whether she possessed even minimal competence for the role she was about to assume. They arrived at the Evans townhouse with sharp eyes and sharper questions, probing for weaknesses like physicians searching for disease. Lady Pemberton was among the first, arriving with her daughter and a barely concealed agenda. She settled herself in the drawing room and immediately began asking questions about Charlotte's plans for managing Thornfield Manor. I assume you have considered the staffing requirements, Lady Pemberton inquired. Thornfield employs upwards of 60 servants between the main house and the London residence. Have you experience managing such numbers? Charlotte felt her palms growing damp beneath her gloves. I have been studying household management with Lady Ashford. I am learning the systems currently in place at Thornfield. Learning, Lady Pemberton repeated with a slight smile. How charming. And the annual summer ball that the Duke traditionally hosts for neighbouring families. I suppose you have begun planning that event. It typically accommodates 300 guests. I have not yet addressed specific events, Charlotte admitted, feeling inadequate under the woman's scrutiny. My focus has been on understanding the general operations first. I see. Lady Pemberton exchanged glances with her daughter. Well, I am certain you will manage somehow. The Duchess of Thornfield has traditionally been among the premier hostesses of England, but I suppose standards must evolve with the times. The visit continued in this vein, each question designed to expose Charlotte's ignorance or inexperience. By the time Lady Pemberton departed, Charlotte felt as though she had been dissected and found wanting, and she knew, with grim certainty, that every misstep she had made during the conversation would be repeated in drawing rooms across London by nightfall. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Visitors arrived, asked increasingly pointed questions, and departed with fresh material for gossip. Charlotte heard through Mrs. Foster's network of servants that her every error was being catalogued and discussed. She had addressed Lady Worthington incorrectly. She had served tea in the wrong order of precedence. She had confused a countess with a viscountess and caused unintended offence. Each mistake, however minor, became evidence that she lacked the breeding necessary for her new position. The weight of constant scrutiny began to wear on Charlotte's confidence. She found herself second-guessing every word, every gesture, terrified of providing more ammunition to those who waited eagerly for her to fail. The letter arrived on a grey morning 6 weeks before the wedding. Charlotte found it on the breakfast tray that Mrs. Foster brought to her room, an envelope of expensive cream paper sealed with plain wax. No crest, no identifying marks, just her name written in an elegant hand she did not recognise. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page within. The message was brief and devastatingly precise. Miss Evans, I write this in the spirit of concern for both you and the Duke of Thornfield. You must be aware by now that you lack the education, refinement, and social standing necessary to fulfill the role of Duchess. In the past 6 weeks alone, you have committed 32 documented errors of protocol and etiquette. These failures will only multiply once you assume your position, causing embarrassment to the Duke and damage to the Thornfield name. For his sake, if not your own, consider whether genuine affection should not compel you to release him from this engagement before you cause irreparable harm. A true act of love would be to step aside in favour of someone more suited to the position. The letter was unsigned, but as Charlotte examined the paper more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The watermark, barely visible when held to the light, bore the Thornfield crest. This letter had been written on Alexander's own stationery. Her hands began to tremble. Someone within Alexander's household had sent this letter. Someone with access to his private study and personal supplies. And there was only one person with both the motivation and the opportunity. Lord Henry. Despite his exile to Yorkshire, Alexander's father had found a way to strike at her, using words as weapons where legal maneuvers had failed. The letter's anonymous nature made it impossible to confront directly, but its impact was no less devastating for that. Because buried beneath the cruelty was a kernel of truth that Charlotte could not deny. She had committed errors. 32 documented ones, apparently, though she had lost count herself. She struggled daily with aspects of aristocratic life that came naturally to women raised for such positions. And with each passing day, the gap between what she was and what she was expected to become seemed to widen rather than narrow. Charlotte sat on her bed for a long time, the letter clutched in her hands, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Mrs. Foster found her there an hour later, still frozen, still holding the poisonous paper. "What has happened?" Mrs. Foster demanded, taking the letter and reading it quickly. Her expression darkened with fury. "This is monstrous. Who would send such a thing? Someone who knows exactly how to hurt me," Charlotte whispered. "Someone who understands that I already fear these things, that I lie awake at night wondering if I am making a terrible mistake. Charlotte, you cannot give credence to anonymous cruelty." "But what if they are right?" Charlotte looked up at her former governess with tear-swollen eyes. "What if I'm being selfish, marrying Alexander when I know I will never be what a duchess should be? What if my love for him is causing him harm that I am too blind to see?" "Stop." Mrs. Foster knelt before her, taking Charlotte's hands in a firm grip. "Listen to me, child. You are being targeted by someone who fears losing power over the Duke. Lord Henry's entire identity was wrapped up in controlling his son, and you have freed Alexander from that control. This letter is a desperate attempt to manipulate you into removing yourself because you cannot be removed by any other means." "The errors are real," Charlotte said. "The 32 mistakes I have made, the gaps in my education, my unsuitability, are all things that can be corrected with time and practice. What cannot be corrected is a loveless marriage, a life lived in service to duty alone. Alexander chose you, knowing exactly who you are. Will you insult him by assuming you know his needs better than he does?" But the seed of doubt had been planted. And in the days that followed, it grew like a weed through Charlotte's confidence. She found herself reviewing every interaction with Alexander, searching for signs of regret or embarrassment. She saw hesitation where there was only fatigue, frustration where there was merely preoccupation with estate matters. Her imagination, fed by fear and Lord Henry's calculated cruelty, transformed ordinary moments into evidence of impending disaster. By the time another week had passed, Charlotte had convinced herself that the honourable course was to end the engagement. She would release Alexander from his obligation, spare him the embarrassment of her inevitable failures, and return to the invisibility that had always been her natural state. It would hurt, perhaps more than anything had ever hurt before, but pain was preferable to watching the man she loved gradually realize he had made a catastrophic mistake. She requested that Alexander call upon her privately, and he arrived the following afternoon with concern evident in his expression. Mrs. Foster admitted him to the drawing room and then, with obvious reluctance, left them alone with the door appropriately ajar for propriety. "Charlotte, what is wrong?" Alexander asked immediately, crossing to take her hands. "You look as though you have not slept in days." "I have not," she admitted. "Alexander, I need to speak with you about something important, about us and our future, and whether—" She trailed off, unable to form the words that would end everything. Alexander guided her to sit on the sofa, taking the place beside her with their hands still clasped. "Tell me. Whatever it is, we will face it together." Charlotte withdrew the anonymous letter from her pocket and handed it to him. She watched his face as he read, saw the anger tighten his jaw, the way his eyes went cold and hard. "Lord Henry," he said flatly. It was not a question. "I recognize the watermark on the paper. It is from Thornfield." Alexander crumpled the letter in his fist. "He has been trying to reach me for weeks. Letters, messages through intermediaries, all attempting to convince me to reconsider our engagement. I have ignored them all. So now he attempts to reach you instead. using the same weapons he always deploys: doubt, fear, and calculated cruelty. But Alexander, Charlotte forced herself to continue. What if he is right? What if I truly am unsuitable, and my presence in your life will cause more harm than good? I make mistakes constantly. I embarrass you with my ignorance. You have never embarrassed me, Alexander interrupted firmly. Not once. Do you know what embarrasses me? The petty cruelty of people who measure worth by birth rather than character. The rigid adherence to meaningless rules of protocol that value form over substance. The way society treats intelligent, capable women as though they are ornamental rather than essential. He set aside the crumpled letter and took both of Charlotte's hands in his. I need to tell you something about my mother and my father and the truth of my upbringing. Charlotte listened as Alexander spoke, his voice steady but weighted with old pain. He told her about his mother's journals, which he had discovered hidden in a trunk in the attic years after her death. He told her about the entries that described his father's slow transformation from a man who had married for money but found love into a bitter widower who blamed his wife's common origins for her death, as though her merchant blood had somehow made her weaker. After my mother died, my father became obsessed with erasing her influence from my life, Alexander said. He hired tutors who were instructed to mold me into the perfect aristocrat, cold and political, and utterly devoted to duty above all else. For years I complied, because I did not know any alternative. I was being prepared for an arranged marriage to whichever suitable candidate could advance our interests most effectively. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon. These are some of my mother's letters to my father, from early in their marriage. She writes about the joy of genuine connection, the value of partnership between equals, the importance of choosing authenticity over appearance. My father kept them hidden away, but I found them after he left for Yorkshire. Alexander handed the letters to Charlotte, who unfolded the top one with trembling fingers. The handwriting was feminine and flowing, the words tender and wise. My dearest Henry, it read, you worry so much about what society thinks of our union, but I beg you to consider what truly matters. When we are old and grey, we will not remember the whispers of strangers or the opinions of those who never knew us. We will remember the quiet moments of understanding, the conversations that stretched into dawn, the way you see me truly rather than as I am supposed to be. That is the gift of genuine love. It values what is real over what is merely acceptable. Hold fast to that, my love, and society's judgment will fade to insignificance. Charlotte read through several more letters, each one reinforcing the same themes. The importance of authentic connection, the value of being seen and accepted as one truly is, the danger of sacrificing real feeling for social approval. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face again. But these were different from the tears of doubt and fear. Your mother was extraordinary, she whispered. Yes, Alexander agreed, and she would have adored you, because you possess the same quality she valued above all else, the courage to be genuinely yourself, despite pressure to conform. He cupped Charlotte's face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I am not marrying you despite your supposed unsuitability. I am marrying you because you are the only woman I have ever met who makes me feel that I can be genuinely myself as well. Do you understand? You have not trapped me or manipulated me. You have freed me. But the mistakes are temporary. Protocol can be learned. Etiquette can be studied. But authenticity, courage, the ability to love without pretense, these cannot be taught. And these are what I value in you above everything else. The space between them seemed to shrink until Charlotte could see the flecks of darker blue in Alexander's eyes, could feel his breath warm against her face. This time, there was no interruption, no footman with urgent messages, no crisis to pull them apart. Alexander's lips met hers in a kiss that started gentle but deepened, as Charlotte's hands came up to clutch his shoulders, pulling him closer. It was nothing like the public kiss in the ballroom after his proposal. This was private, intimate, a promise made in whispers rather than declarations. Charlotte felt something fundamental shift inside her. doubt giving way to certainty, fear transforming into trust. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "No more doubts," he said quietly. "No more listening to poison from people who do not know us. We have chosen each other, Charlotte. That choice is valid and true, regardless of what anyone else thinks." "No more doubts," Charlotte agreed. And this time she believed it. They sat together in companionable silence, hands entwined, as afternoon sunlight filtered through the drawing-room windows. The anonymous letter lay discarded on the floor, its power broken by truth and trust. Outside, London continued its endless cycle of gossip and judgment. But in this moment, Charlotte found she no longer cared what society thought. She had Alexander's love, his respect, his partnership. She had proven her courage in the council chamber and her resilience in the face of social cruelty. And she had 3 months to continue learning what she needed to know, supported by tutors and Mrs. Foster, and most importantly, by a man who valued her for precisely who she was. The wedding preparations continued, but with a new energy born of renewed certainty. Charlotte attacked her lessons with fresh determination, no longer motivated by fear of failure, but by genuine desire to be a capable partner in their shared future. The errors still happened. She would probably never master every nuance of aristocratic protocol, but they no longer felt like evidence of fundamental unworthiness. And when Lord Henry's letters continued to arrive, attempting to sow fresh doubts, Charlotte burned them unread. She had made her choice, and she would not be moved from it by anonymous cruelty or calculated manipulation. She was going to marry Alexander Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, and together they would build something real and lasting, founded on truth rather than pretense, on partnership rather than duty, on love that valued substance over appearance. Society could whisper all it wanted. Charlotte had finally stopped listening. The morning of Charlotte's wedding dawned clear and bright, early autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of her bedchamber at the Evans townhouse. She had slept poorly, excitement and nervousness warring in her chest, and now she sat before her mirror while Mrs. Foster arranged her hair with careful precision. "You are ready for this," Mrs. Foster said softly, meeting Charlotte's eyes in the mirror. "Everything you have endured these past months has prepared you." Charlotte managed a tremulous smile. "I hope so, though I confess part of me still cannot believe this is truly happening." The wedding gown lay across her bed, a masterpiece of champagne silk that had belonged to Alexander's mother. He had presented it to Charlotte 6 weeks earlier, the fabric carefully preserved despite the passage of years. Charlotte had wept when she first saw it, touched beyond words by the gesture of including Alexander's mother in their ceremony despite her long absence. Mrs. Foster had worked with a seamstress to alter the gown to fit Charlotte's slighter frame, taking in seams and adjusting the bodice while preserving the essential character of the dress. The result was a gown of simple elegance, free from excessive ornamentation, but breathtaking in its classical lines, and the quality of the silk that caught light like liquid gold. A knock sounded at the door, and Lord Edmund entered. He had dressed with unusual care for the occasion, his formal attire emphasizing the dignity that had always been present beneath his quiet demeanor. He stopped when he saw Charlotte, emotion flickering across his face. "You look beautiful, my dear," he said quietly. "Your mother would be... That is, I am very proud of you." The near slip about her mother did not escape Charlotte's notice. Lady Margaret had maintained an icy distance throughout the final weeks of wedding preparations, her fury at Charlotte's triumph manifesting in pointed silences and deliberate absences. She would attend the wedding because propriety demanded it, but she had made clear that her presence was a concession to social expectation rather than maternal feeling. "Thank you, Father," Charlotte replied, rising to embrace him, "for everything, for supporting my choice when you might have sided with Mother, for defending my right to accept Alexander's courtship. I know it has not been easy." Lord Edmund cleared his throat, visibly moved. A father's duty is to his daughter's happiness, not society's expectations. "I only regret that it took me so long to remember that." He offered his arm. "The carriage is ready. Shall we?" The journey to Thornfield took an hour, the small wedding party travelling in Lord Edmund's finest carriage. Amelia rode with them, resplendent in pale gold silk that complemented her beauty but could not quite disguise the bitterness in her expression. She had barely spoken to Charlotte in weeks, communicating only when absolutely necessary, and then with cutting politeness that hurt more than open hostility. Lady Margaret travelled separately with distant cousins, unwilling to share close quarters with the daughter who had defied her so completely. Charlotte told herself she did not care, that her mother's approval was no longer necessary for her happiness. But some small part of her still ached for the warmth that had never quite been offered, the unconditional love that had always seemed just out of reach. Thornfield Chapel stood on the estate grounds, a medieval structure of grey stone softened by centuries of weathering. Ancient yew trees surrounded it, their branches creating natural arches that framed the approach. As their carriage rolled to a stop, Charlotte could see other vehicles already arrived. Society's elite gathered to witness what many still considered an improbable union. Inside the chapel, candles blazed despite the afternoon sunlight, streaming through stained glass windows. The pews were filled with curious faces, some friendly, many skeptical, all waiting to see how the scandalous courtship would culminate. Charlotte glimpsed Lady Pemberton whispering behind her fan, saw Lord Montague from the council regarding her with thoughtful approval, noticed a dozen other faces that had featured in her social education over the past months. And there, standing before the altar with the minister, was Alexander. He wore formal black that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, his dark hair carefully arranged, his blue eyes fixed on the chapel entrance with an intensity that made Charlotte's breath catch. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the barely contained emotion that he held in check through sheer force of will. A footman approached Lord Edmund with a sealed letter on a silver salver. "From Lord Henry, sir. It arrived by special messenger this morning with instructions that it be delivered to the Duke before the ceremony." Lord Edmund took the letter, his expression darkening. "I will ensure the Duke receives it." He tucked it into his coat and turned to Charlotte. "Are you ready, my dear?" Charlotte nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Mrs." Foster adjusted her veil one final time, smoothed the champagne silk of her gown, and handed her the bouquet of white lilies that had been specially grown in Thornfield's conservatory. "Remember who you are," Mrs. Foster whispered. "Remember what you have overcome to reach this moment. Let no one make you feel less than worthy of this happiness." The music began. A triumphant melody played on the chapel's ancient organ. Charlotte took her father's arm and stepped into the aisle. Immediately she felt the weight of every eye upon her, heard the whispers that even music could not completely mask. "She looks better than expected, given her plain features. The gown is lovely, though naturally it suited the Duke's mother better. I give this marriage 5 years before he realizes his mistake." Charlotte's steps faltered, old insecurities threatening to overwhelm her courage, but her father's hand tightened on her arm, steadying her, head high. Lord Edmund murmured, "You are about to become a duchess. They can whisper all they wish, but you have won what they could only dream of achieving." Charlotte lifted her chin and continued forward, focusing on Alexander rather than the judging faces on either side. He watched her approach with an expression that made her forget the whispers entirely. There was no doubt in his eyes, no hesitation or second thoughts. Only love, pure and unwavering, and a joy so profound it seemed to radiate from him like warmth from a fire. When they reached the altar, Lord Edmund placed Charlotte's hand in Alexander's, and the simple contact sent electricity racing through her veins. Alexander's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and real. "You are stunning," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "Just as I knew you would be." The minister began the ceremony, his voice carrying through the chapel with solemn authority. Charlotte heard the words as though from a great distance, her awareness narrowed to Alexander's hand holding hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes never left her face. If any person can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibility. Charlotte half expected some final intervention, some last-minute objection that would prevent this impossible happiness. But the silence held, and the minister continued. Alexander James Bellini, Duke of Thornfield, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? I do, Alexander said, his voice clear and firm, carrying to every corner of the chapel. Charlotte Ann Evans, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? Charlotte met Alexander's eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. I do. The rings were exchanged, simple gold bands that symbolized promises made and accepted. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander pulled Charlotte into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The chapel erupted in applause, genuine and enthusiastic from some corners, grudging from others, but undeniable in its volume. They walked back down the aisle together as Duke and Duchess, and Charlotte felt the weight of the title settle onto her shoulders. It was heavy, yes, but not unbearable. Not when shared with the man whose hand remained firmly clasped in hers. The reception was held in Thornfield's grand ballroom, the same room where Charlotte had first dined months ago, under Lord Henry's hostile scrutiny. Now it had been transformed with flowers and candles, the long tables laden with food and wine, musicians positioned in the gallery to provide entertainment. Guests mingled with the careful social choreography of the aristocracy, alliances and hierarchies playing out in seating arrangements and conversation groups. Charlotte stood beside Alexander, receiving congratulations and well-wishes with a grace that surprised even herself. The training of the past months manifested in smooth responses and appropriate reactions, protocol becoming second nature under the pressure of necessity. When the time came for speeches, Charlotte felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. She had not prepared formal remarks, assuming that the Duchess's role was to remain decorously silent while others spoke. But Alexander caught her hand and drew her forward, indicating that she should address their guests. Charlotte looked out at the assembled crowd, seeing faces friendly and hostile, curious and judgmental, supportive and skeptical. She thought about everything she had endured to reach this moment, the whispers, the deliberate humiliations, the constant scrutiny. She thought about the courage it had taken to stand before the council, to face down her sister's sabotage, to continue forward despite doubt and fear. "My lords and ladies," she began, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "I stand before you today profoundly aware that many of you question my suitability for the position I have assumed. You are not wrong to have doubts. I was not raised from childhood to be a duchess. I did not attend continental finishing schools or receive the education typically expected of someone in my position." She paused, letting the admission settle. "But I have spent the past months learning what I did not know, supported by patient tutors and the unwavering faith of my husband. I will continue to learn, to grow, to become worthy of the title I now hold. What I can promise you is this: I will approach my duties with integrity, compassion, and dedication. I will value substance over appearance, truth over convenient pretense, and I will strive every day to honor the man who saw worth in me when others saw only inadequacy." The ballroom had fallen silent, every guest focused on her words. Charlotte turned to Alexander, her eyes finding his. "You have given me not just a title, but the courage to believe I might deserve it. For that, and for so much more, I thank you." The applause that followed was genuine, without the grudging quality that had characterized earlier responses. Charlotte saw surprised respect on faces that had held only skepticism, heard murmurs of approval from those who had expected vapid platitudes, rather than honest acknowledgement of her limitations and strengths. Lady Pemberton approached after the speech, her expression thoughtful. "Your Grace, I confess I underestimated you." "That was remarkably well done. Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Charlotte replied, using the correct form of address without conscious thought. I appreciate your kind words. As the reception continued, Charlotte noticed Amelia moving through the crowd with determined purpose, heading directly toward the wedding cake that stood on a central table. There was something in her sister's expression, a reckless desperation, that set alarm bells ringing in Charlotte's mind. But before Amelia could reach whatever target she intended, Lady Margaret intercepted her. Charlotte watched in astonishment as her mother, who had barely acknowledged her existence all day, caught Amelia's arm and spoke to her in a fierce whisper. Whatever she said caused Amelia's face to crumple, tears spilling down her cheeks as she allowed herself to be led from the ballroom. Lady Margaret returned moments later, approaching Charlotte with an expression caught between shame and resignation. "Your Grace," she said, the title sounding strange in her mother's voice. "I apologize for the disturbance. Your sister will not trouble you further today." Charlotte stared at her mother, searching for some explanation for this sudden shift. Lady Margaret seemed to read the question in her eyes. "I have been a fool," Lady Margaret said quietly, "blinded by vanity and ambition until I nearly lost both my daughters. Amelia to bitterness, and you." She trailed off, then continued with obvious difficulty. "You to justified estrangement. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see clearly now what I refused to see before. You have become a duchess through courage and character, while I tried to force the position onto someone who possessed neither. I was wrong, Charlotte. Profoundly, foolishly wrong." It was not a full reconciliation, not the maternal warmth Charlotte had always craved, but it was more than she had ever received before, an acknowledgement and apology that felt genuine despite its imperfection. "Thank you, Mother," Charlotte said softly. "That means more than you know." Lord Edmund appeared at Charlotte's other side, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I am proud of you, daughter. Your Grace," he corrected with a smile. "I suspect I shall have difficulty remembering to use your title. You may call me Charlotte in private, Father. I have not forgotten who I was before today." "No," Lord Edmund agreed, his eyes bright with emotion. "But you have become so much more than you were. That is what growth looks like, my dear. Never forget that." Mrs. Foster watched from a discreet distance, her weathered face alight with joy and pride. When Charlotte caught her eye, the former governess pressed a hand to her heart in a gesture that needed no words. Charlotte smiled back, grateful beyond measure for the steady presence that had sustained her through every trial. The celebration continued late into the evening, but eventually the guests departed, leaving Charlotte and Alexander alone in the quiet grandeur of Thornfield Manor. They stood together in the entrance hall, still dressed in their wedding finery, and Charlotte felt the enormity of what they had accomplished settle over her like a warm cloak. "We did it," she said wonderingly. "Despite everything, we actually did it." "Did you ever truly doubt we would?" Alexander asked, pulling her close. "Every single day," Charlotte admitted with a laugh. "But apparently doubt and determination can coexist." "Indeed they can." Alexander kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "Welcome home, Duchess. Welcome to the beginning of everything." 2 years later, Charlotte stood in the nursery at Thornfield Manor, watching their son sleep in his cradle. Thomas Alexander Bellini, barely 6 months old, had his father's dark hair and his mother's brown eyes, and was already demonstrating a strong will that promised interesting years ahead. "He is perfect," Mrs. Foster said softly from the doorway. She had taken a position as Charlotte's personal companion, a retirement of sorts that kept her close to the girl she had raised. "He is stubborn and demanding and keeps us awake at all hours," Charlotte replied fondly. "Yes, he is perfect." A knock sounded at the nursery door, and Alexander entered with a letter in his hand. His expression was complicated, caught between hope and wariness. "It is from my father," he said quietly. "He writes to congratulate us on Thomas's birth and to request reconciliation. He says that becoming a grandfather has made him reconsider his choices, that he regrets the estrangement." Charlotte moved to her husband's side, reading the letter over his shoulder. Lord Henry's handwriting, once so proud and decisive, seemed shakier now, the words themselves carrying a humility she had never expected to see from that quarter. "What do you wish to do?" she asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. I wish to give him a chance. With limitations, with boundaries. But a chance nonetheless. Thomas deserves to know his grandfather. If that grandfather can prove himself worthy of the privilege, then we shall allow it. Charlotte agreed. Carefully, gradually, but we shall allow it. Forgiveness is not weakness, Alexander. It is strength. They drafted a response together, inviting Lord Henry to visit at Thornfield in the spring, with the understanding that his presence was conditional on respectful behaviour towards Charlotte and recognition of her position as Duchess. It was not unconditional reconciliation, but it was a beginning. In the 2 years since the night of ruined silk and public scandal, the Evans household had learned that cruelty carried its own price. Lady Margaret's invitations grew fewer, and the influence she had once wielded began to slip through her fingers. She spent more time at their country estate than in London, and when she wrote to Charlotte at last, her apology was restrained, but real. Amelia, deprived of an audience, was sent away for a season under the care of an aunt and returned quieter, eventually accepting a respectable match far from the sharper circles where she had once tried to shine. It was not absolution, but it was closure. That evening, Charlotte and Alexander attended Lady Margaret Evans's annual spring ball, the same event where their story had begun 2 years earlier. Charlotte entered the ballroom on her husband's arm, no longer the invisible spinster hiding behind columns, but a confident Duchess who had earned her position through trials that would have broken weaker spirits. As she moved through the crowd, accepting greetings and making appropriate conversation, Charlotte noticed a young woman standing alone near the windows. She was perhaps 20, plainly dressed in an unfashionable shade of brown, her posture suggesting she was trying to occupy as little space as possible. Her eyes held that same desperate hope of invisibility that Charlotte recognized from her own past. Charlotte excused herself from the conversation she had been conducting and crossed to the young woman, who looked up in surprise as a duchess approached her directly. "Good evening," Charlotte said warmly. "I am Charlotte Bellini, Duchess of Thornfield. I do not believe we have been introduced." "Miss Sarah Mitchell, Your Grace," the young woman stammered, executing an awkward curtsy. "I apologize. I did not mean to be in your way." "You are not in my way," Charlotte interrupted gently. "I simply noticed you standing alone and thought you might appreciate company. These events can be overwhelming, especially when one is not accustomed to them." Miss Mitchell's eyes widened with surprised gratitude. "They are rather intimidating, Your Grace. I confess I feel quite out of place." "I understand that feeling better than you might imagine," Charlotte replied. She spent the next 20 minutes in genuine conversation with Miss Mitchell, discovering a sharp wit and keen intelligence hidden beneath the young woman's shy exterior. When a gentleman approached to request a dance, Charlotte encouraged Miss Mitchell to accept, watching with satisfaction as the young woman stepped onto the floor with new confidence. Alexander joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Still rescuing wallflowers, I see." "Someone once rescued me," Charlotte replied, looking up at him with a smile. "I am simply returning the favour." They stood together watching the dancers, and Charlotte felt the completeness of her happiness settle around her like a benediction. She had faced doubt, cruelty, manipulation, and constant scrutiny. She had been tested in ways she never imagined she could survive, and she had emerged not just intact, but transformed, strengthened by trials into someone worthy of the title she now held. The young woman who had hidden behind columns and believed herself invisible was gone. In her place stood a duchess who understood that true worth had nothing to do with birth or beauty or perfection. It had everything to do with courage, integrity, and the willingness to be genuinely oneself, despite all pressure to conform. Charlotte Evans Bellini, Duchess of Thornfield, had found her voice and her strength, and she would spend the rest of her life ensuring that other quiet, overlooked women might find theirs as well. And from that improbable beginning, everything else had followed.